This is Right to Life Radio with John Girardi on Power Talk 96.7 and AM 1400, a production of the Right to Life of Central California. And now, here's your host, John Girardi.
Thank you to the deep voice man, Mr. Jonathan Keller. This is Right to Life Radio. I am John Girardi. Thank you all so much for tuning in to this high-quality program. We at Right to Life Radio always break down for you the most important news and information relating to the political and cultural topic of abortion, where things are going in our country, in our state, and locally. All right, to talk about today, we've got an interesting story to bring up. As you all know, for those of you listening to the show, you know I am a student of the pro-choice side. I am a student of the rhetoric they use. I try to keep tabs on the kind of language they use, how they try to advocate for what they advocate. Safe, legal, and universally accessible abortion, although it's never really safe for one of the two parties involved. One of the little shifts, there are a lot of major shifts that are happening in the way that the pro-choice side talks about abortion. There's the shift away from safe, legal, and rare to safe, legal, and accessible. There's a language of abortion as an essential healthcare service as opposed to something that's purely a question of choice. But the topic I want to dig into today is a little more minute. It's the question of abortion and whether we should call it surgical abortion or not. Now, I've got an interesting piece on it written by Alexandra DeSanctis, who writes at National Review. She's sort of their watchdog on all things relating to the topic of abortion. And she has this excellent piece, which I've retweeted at my Twitter account, at Fresno Johnny, about the language surrounding abortion. So let's dig into it. Rewire News, an online pro-abortion publication, is rarely worth paying attention to. But occasionally the site features an article that proves useful for highlighting a trend in the changing policy goals or rhetoric of the abortion rights movement's most radical wing. The site's latest editorial is an example of the latter, giving insight into how abortion advocates shift their language to influence public perception of what abortion is, and as a consequence, whether it should be permitted. Notes on Language, Why We Stopped Using Surgical Abortion at Rewire News is the title of the article, written by Rewire's managing editor, Regina Mahone. So why would they want to get away from the language of surgical abortion? Well, let's understand. Instead of referring to medication and surgical abortion to distinguish between abortions induced by pills and abortions induced as an in-clinic procedure, Rewire News will use medication and procedural abortion, Mahone writes. All right, so let me break this all down for you in simple terms. There are two ways, broadly speaking, in which abortion is performed. One way is through pills. Okay, I'm not going to say medication because I don't want to admit that this is actual medication treats a healthcare problem, a malady in the body, something that is not functioning properly in the human body and brings it to a state of functioning properly. That's what medication is. That's what healthcare is. All right, I reject the notion that that's what abortion is. So abortion via pill is the process where you take two pills. You take one pill in the clinical context called mifepristone or RU-486, and then a day or two later, you take misoprostol at home. The misoprostol is basically the medication that you take that basically artificially induces a miscarriage. It artificially induces a miscarriage at home. So that's what so-called medication abortion is, or abortion via pill. All other abortions have typically been called surgical abortions, okay? These are abortions that are done via a number of means, and these are usually done on later-term pregnancies for children who have developed so far that you can't use abortion via pill. You can only do abortion via pill for like the first 10 weeks of pregnancy. So instead of calling it surgical, in spite of the fact that you are entering a woman's body. You are withdrawing another human being. It often, and in many cases, it involves cutting another human being. Okay, not to get too graphic about it, but basically, why would the pro-choice side be opposed to this language of surgical? Well, let's dig into it. This is what Rewire News says, why they're changing their terminology to get away from the term surgical abortion. The term surgical abortion has been used by health professionals, and until now by Rewire News to define any in-clinic abortion not induced by medication. For pregnancies in the first trimester, which is when the vast majority of abortions occur, this involves a procedure called vacuum aspiration. The word surgical in this instance is misleading. The procedure doesn't typically require cutting or suturing of any kind. It's a 5 to 10 minute process involving gentle suction to remove the products of conception from the uterus. Products of conception. Gentle suction. So this is all it is. And this is one of the frustrating things about dealing with the rhetoric of the pro-choice side, okay? They in the media and these sort of neutral arbiters, these allegedly neutral arbiters of this abortion debate, particularly in the media, have sort of made this decision for us. We don't call pro-lifers in media articles, pro-lifers are not called pro-life. Why? They're called, instead they're called anti-abortion or anti-abortion rights. Now, to a certain extent, I don't know that I necessarily dislike being called anti-abortion. I am anti-abortion. I think abortion's bad. I want people not to have them. I want people not to choose them. I want states and the federal government not to allow it to be legal. Nevertheless, it's obvious what the media is doing. They're saying, well, you're not pro-life. I mean, life is just a kind of euphemism that you're using here. So we're going to refer to you as anti-abortion. That's really what you are. At the same time, though, advocates for abortion were able to get the euphemistic PR, their favored euphemistic PR term forever. They were called pro-choice. Have you ever stopped and thought how ridiculous that is? Choice, pro-choice. Why is that the word that characterizes this whole movement? There are gazillions of choices out there in life that you could readily call a given political movement. Why are people who advocate for school vouchers, why are they not called pro-choice? And that's what they are. They want choice. They want to give parents the choice to send their kids to either use the taxpayer dollars allocated for their kid to have their kid go to a public school or to go to a private school. They advocate for choice. But we don't call advocates for vouchers pro-choice. There are all kinds of political movements that encourage people to choose certain kinds of things. But we don't call them pro-choice. We only call this movement pro-choice. This movement, which advocates for abortion to be legal so that women can choose it if they want. And that whole movement for this one very specific choice is called the pro-choice movement. And the media has very willingly gone along with that characterization, with that euphemism, with that PR cover. It's got to be a rule of three. It's got to use three things. That euphemism, that PR cover, etc. The media has willingly gone along with that for almost without any sort of self-examination, without any sort of self-criticism, without any sort of question. The legalized abortion advocates try to paint themselves in the cover of abortion rights advocates. And the media talks about it, the people who advocate for abortion rights, opponents of abortion rights. When you use the language of advocates for abortion rights and opponents of abortion rights, you're admitting that abortion rights are a thing that exists. But that's the central debate between the two sides. Whether there is a right to abortion in the Constitution is the central active debate between those who favor legalized abortion and those who oppose it. So the media is totally willing to go along with the favored PR measures of one side of this side of the debate. And and it goes along with it in all kinds of contexts. It gives away the store when the media refers to abortion as a healthcare procedure, as medication. These are all things that the pro-life side actually actively disputes. I actively dispute the notion that abortion is a healthcare procedure. I don't think it's a healthcare procedure. Healthcare procedures involve fixing things that are wrong with the human body. Pregnancy is not something that is wrong with the human body. There are all kinds of ways in which the media covers up for the pro-abortion side in order to present it in a more positive PR light. And I think this is coming up as the next instance. When people think of surgical abortion, they naturally think of human beings being cut up and diced and sliced. They naturally think of human beings being killed. So you know what? Look, for these kinds of, aspiration abortions where human beings are being vacuumed out of the womb, I'm willing to call it that. How about vacuum abortions? I'd be willing to call it that. I just so resent this notion that whatever the pro-choice side, even I'm calling them pro-choice, whatever the pro-legalized abortion side, it's probably the most accurate way to refer to them, whatever they want from the media, as far as characterizing who they are, what they believe, that is what they get. All right, now when we come back, we're going to talk about the power of PR, okay? Because PR is incredibly powerful, and it has a big impact on the abortion debate, but it has even broader effects on American life in ways you wouldn't imagine. We're going to talk about that right after the break. You're listening to Right to Life Radio on Power Talk 96.7 AM 1400 and the iHeartRadio app. Okay, we're now going to talk about PR. What is the importance of PR? All right, I want to give you an example of the greatest act of PR ever and how it had a tremendous effect on American law. And we're dealing with this because of the rhetoric and the language that the pro-choice side has employed. Here I am even calling them pro-choice. The pro-legalized abortion side has had since Roe v. Wade. They have had enormous PR success. They managed to get their whole movement called the choice movement, the pro-choice movement, this very nice positive word, and they got the whole media to go along with calling us anti-abortion. A much more negative sounding thing. We're antis. We're not pro, we're anti. We are the ones who have called ourselves pro-life. We are the ones who have done that. They have never afforded us that courtesy. So let me talk to you about the power of PR, and let me give a great example of this in American law. I think the best example of this has been the idea of the separation of church and state. Now, how many of you listening to this think that term, separation of church and state, how many of you think that term is in the Constitution? Probably a lot of you listening think, oh yeah, well that's in the Constitution, separation of church and state, right? Blah, 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 blah. Incorrectamundo. Separation of church and state is actually not in the Constitution. We have the First Amendment in the Constitution, which says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of a national church. But there's nothing in the Constitution that says that there is a wall of separation between church and state. That was from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote. Okay? But because that term, separation of church and state, separation of church and state, separation of church and state, because advocates of certain political goals and agendas have repeated this nonstop, ad nauseum, for decades, they have been so successful that the phrase separation of church and state has been pretty much sucked up even by Supreme Court justices issuing majority decisions in Supreme Court cases to such an extent that even though the term separation of church and state is not in the Constitution, it has now entered American law in this incredibly powerful way. It has entered Supreme Court majority decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court and has become a fixture within American constitutional law. It's the greatest PR campaign in the history of this country, the phrase separation of church and state. You repeat this often enough, and eventually people begin to think it's true. It's even more crazy when you hear about the kinds of things that people didn't view as being problematic in light of the First Amendment in the founding era, including like the various, the federal government was not allowed under the First Amendment to establish religion, but there were a lot of individual states who had official state churches at the time of the founding. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. What I'm saying is that rhetoric is important. Rhetoric, the way you talk about something, is the first argument you make. It's the first way of presenting to your audience how a thing is, what a thing is, and how a thing is viewed. And that's why I tend to talk about rhetoric a lot as far as how we approach abortion. We see right now there's a fight going on surrounding coronavirus and abortion because so many states have basically shut down or pushed off any, quote, non-essential healthcare procedures, including any non-essential surgical procedures, something my dad at Valley Children's Hospital is going through right now, because states throughout the country are pushing those kinds of things off. Basically, there are some states where they are lumping in surgical abortion with all that. They're saying, well, we're lumping off non-necessary elective surgical procedures. Abortion is one of those things. Therefore, we are pushing it off. Therefore, we're saying that we're not going to allow abortions to go on right now. We need all these healthcare resources to be allocated in case there's a big surge in coronavirus. And so Planned Parenthood in Texas has been shut down to a large extent, although I think this is starting to open up now. Their abortion business has been more or less shut down in Texas and a number of other states. So what Planned Parenthood and its willing allies in the media are trying to do is trying to say, hey, no. Abortion, even, we may call it surgical abortion, but it's not like really a surgery. We're just vacuuming out a human organism out of your womb. We're doing something that's more extreme than an induced miscarriage. So they're trying to win this PR battle by referring to aspiration abortions as, oh, it's not a surgical abortion, it's a gentle sucking, removing the product of conception from the womb. And there are so many ways in which they try to argue for what they argue with rhetoric. Okay, any pro-life person who says, oh my gosh, they're killing that unborn child, everyone on the pro-choice side immediately jumps in. There's no such thing as an unborn child. That's scientifically inaccurate usage. The correct and appropriate term is fetus. Which is like, okay, I get it. If we're talking in scientific terms about the development of the human organism in a biology class, then yes, I'm going to use the proper terminology of a fetus. But when I see my pregnant friend or my pregnant wife and say, hey, when's our fetus going to be born? I don't do that. I say, when's our baby going to be born? When's your baby going to be born? When is this baby coming out? Our whole culture refers to pregnant women as having, quote, baby bumps, which I've always been a little weirded out by that terminology. It's not a bump, it's a baby. Anyway, we accept that people broadly throughout our culture, when they're talking about a baby they want to keep, when they're talking about an unborn child, when they're talking about a fetus that they want to keep, we're totally fine and happy with referring to that fetus as a baby. But the minute that this is a fetus we no longer want to keep, the minute this is a fetus we would like to abort, instead, we insist the pro-choice side becomes a bunch of finger-wagging schoolmarms who say, no, you're using imprecise terminology. How dare you refer to this child as a fetus? I'm just like, well, first of all, I'm totally fine with referring to this child as a fetus. You're killing a fetal human being, okay? that is, just because you use the term fetus doesn't change it. But there's obviously a different rhetorical impact that hits your ear when you say, we terminated the pregnancy and removed a fetus, as opposed to killing an unborn baby. There's a different impact that occurs. And now the pro-choice side has taken it, the pro-legalized abortion side rather, has taken it even a step further. We talked about this last week on the show in our investigation of the Planned Parenthood clinic in Fresno, and the investigation of how they were selling the body parts of unborn children. The term products of conception. They won't actually acknowledge the fact that this is the body of a killed human being. This is a human being's body that has been killed. Instead, they're now starting to refer to this as products of conception. This is from that Rewire News story talking about how they're not going to refer to abortion as surgical abortion anymore. They write that, in vacuum aspiration abortions, they say the word surgical in this instance is misleading. The procedure doesn't typically require cutting or suturing of any kind. It's a 5 to 10 minute process involving gentle suction to remove the products of conception from the uterus. So there are any way in which the pro-choice side can sort of anesthetize and make abortion look as simple and clean and clear-cut and non-controversial and not hitting your ear in a horrible, offensive-sounding way, in a way that reveals the truth of what's happening. Any way that they can, that's what they're trying to do. Okay? They're not going to refer to abortion via pill as abortion via pill. They're going to refer to it as medical abortion. They're not going to refer to an abortion where you're halfway delivering the baby as partial birth abortion. They're going to refer to it as late-term abortions. They refer to abortion as abortion care. Abortion isn't, and even now they're getting away from the language of choice to say, well, abortion is never elective. Abortion is never an elective procedure. Abortion is always necessary health care. So that in the event of something like, say, coronavirus, you can't tell an abortion clinic to stop performing abortions. That's what's happened in California. So that you can compel insurance companies to cover abortion in all of their insurance plans that they offer for companies that are offering insurance for their employees. PR is this incredibly important thing for the pro-choice side. All right, when we come back, we're going to talk about sort of an evergreen topic. This was suggested to me by some fans of the show. The evergreen topic of how come some human organisms, some unborn children, are treated like human beings under law, and some are not. We'll dig into that right after the break. You're listening to Right to Life Radio on Power Talk 96.7 AM 1400. So, being the director at Right to Life of Central California, there are a number. I'm the go-to guy for a lot of people throughout this region who have questions about abortion. I imagine there are many priests out there who have a similar feel they are similarly the target for lots of different questions about different things. I think I sort of get what they experience maybe to an infinitesimally small fractional degree. Regardless, when people have questions about abortion, they typically come to me and ask my opinion and thought about whether it's some public policy thing. And one of the questions I get most often is the question of, how come in California, we passed that Connor and Lacey law for, Connor Peterson, who killed his wife. Not Connor Peterson, Scott Peterson. Scott Peterson killed his wife, Lacey, and their unborn child, Connor. And the Connor and Lacey law is basically, in California, you kill a pregnant lady, you get charged with 2 acts of homicide. All right? It's a very interesting question. It's sort of a very interesting piece of California law, in spite of the fact that California does everything in its power not to recognize the humanity of unborn children. Nevertheless, in this one area of law, this one area of criminal law, we recognize unborn children as 2 people. And people come up to me and they ask, how can this be? How can this be so? How can we in California acknowledge the humanity of unborn children in this regard, but totally ignore their humanity in any other regard? And there's no really good answer. I guess this is the point I come to. The unfortunate point that I come to in talking with them is simply that California law doesn't make sense. It is illogical. There are certain considerations that motivate it to have one kind of approach to unborn life in some contexts, and other motivations that bring it to other approaches to unborn life in other contexts. Yes, our whole abortion regime is totally screwed up. Our whole abortion regime is oriented around a principle that there is no right that inheres in the unborn human child, the fetus in the womb, that no rights adhere to that person. That is not a human person who has protection from acts of private violence. Nothing. We don't acknowledge that at all. But at the same time, California has a pretty strict criminal law in a lot of ways. Okay, in spite of the fact that we've taken a lot of steps to weaken our criminal law by letting a bunch of people out of jail. Historically, California has had pretty severe criminal law. The 3 strikes law originated right here in California. In some ways, it's a very severe, and some people would argue justly severe. Some people would argue not. It's a very strict and severe kind of law. There's you can get charged in California with second-degree murder for killing someone during a DUI if this is your second DUI. There are all kinds of ways in which California law is extremely severe. And that's a result of California voters sort of wanting it that way in a lot of cases. And so Californians saw this highly publicized case of this horrible murder of this beautiful pregnant woman. And Californians were like, yeah, charge him with 2 murders. Go for it. And we passed the Conner and Lacey law. And it doesn't make sense. I understand. Yeah, it does not make sense why we would treat unborn children as one way, but we would treat the unborn child as a living human person, a member of the community who has legal rights that can be vindicated. For example, the right not to be murdered by your father. But on the other hand, no protection if you are being murdered by a doctor at the wish of your mother. So it does not make sense. But this is not the only area where basically we treat unborn human beings as living human beings for the purposes of law. There are lots of other ways in which this is done. So there's this interesting review that happened in the University of Notre Dame Law Review back in 1971 about whether legal abortion could possibly be reconciled with the many rights that the unborn child enjoys in other areas of the law. And he looked back. He went all the way back to the 18th century. So property law recognizes the rights of the unborn child from the moment of conception for all purposes which affect his property rights. So if you put in your will, okay, I will to divide my property evenly at my death, I will to give all my property evenly to my children. You conceive a child on May 1st, and then you die on June 1st, okay? So now you have, let's say you have 3 children outside of the womb, and your wife is pregnant with baby number 4. Well, guess what? Your property is going to be split up 4 ways, not 3, okay? For the purposes of inheriting stuff, that unborn child is going to get his or her equal share, even though that child is not born yet, okay? So for purposes of property law, unborn children can inherit stuff. The unborn child status for purposes of tort law developed later than for property law, but by 1971, there were 29 states and Washington, D.C., which allowed unborn children to recover damages for prenatal injuries. Okay, so tort law is basically, let's say you get punched in the face by somebody, all right? Now, you can have that person be criminally prosecuted by the state for committing a crime, but then you can also sue that person civilly for harming you in this way through this intentional tort of punching you in the face, okay? So there's criminal prosecution to throw someone in jail, and then there's suing somebody to get money from them, okay? So in tort law, unborn children have the ability to collect from someone who harms them, who engages in harm against them while they are in the womb. They can collect. Now, someone has to sue on their behalf because they're obviously a minor and beyond. But there were all kinds of states, even at the time of Roe v. Wade, that acknowledged the right of fetuses to sue for recovery of damages in the face of a tort. So there are all kinds of ways beyond simply the Connor and Lacey law there are all kinds of ways outside of the Connor and Lacey law. We recognized unborn children as human beings for purposes of the law in a lot of different contexts. Okay, and this was before Roe and even still to this day. So to answer the question, how come California, is going to prosecute someone for double murder when they deliberately kill a pregnant woman? Why would California prosecute someone for double murder in that case, but not view abortion as murder in any other context? Well, folks, there's just no other way to put it. Quite simply, California law is illogical and inconsistent, and the whole thing just does not make a lot of sense. All right, when we get back, we're going to dig into more ways. We're going to dig more into this article from the Charlotte Lozier Institute about ways in which the unborn child was recognized as a person under law, including through the Unborn Victims of Violence Act. So stay tuned for that. You're not going to want to miss it. This is Right to Life Radio on Power Talk 96.7 AM 1400 and the iHeartRadio app. We're talking on Right to Life Radio about the topic of different kinds of ways in which unborn children are recognized as human persons under law, in spite of the fact that there's this huge other glaring part of law where they're not recognized as human, namely in their right to life. And in the last segment, I was talking about historically in American law, there were all kinds of ways in which we did actually recognize unborn human beings as being legal persons under the law. We recognized them as legal persons when it came to inheritance. Okay, as I said, if you have 3 kids, your wife gets pregnant with baby 4, and your will says, I leave all of my possessions in equal proportions to my children, and then you die. Well, guess what? You're not giving it to the 3 children who are born, and unborn baby number 4 gets nothing. You split your possessions 4 ways. That's how that works traditionally under common law as we inherited it. There are all kinds of ways in which unborn children could sue, or really have someone sue for them, for damages that they occur, for tort damages that they accrue. So I've got here this great article that's kind of a summary on that. It's written by the Charlotte Lozier Institute. It's called A Person's a Person: Inconsistent Treatment of the Unborn in the Law. So this is a really interesting article. So let's dig into it. Women in the United States have possessed a broad legal right to abortion since Roe v. Wade and its companion case were handed down by the Supreme Court in 1973. Outside of the abortion context, though, the unborn child possesses broad legal rights in American property, torts, and criminal law. The Roe Court held that it did not need to resolve, quote, the difficult question of when life begins. It acknowledged the state's interest in protecting the health of women and in protecting, quote, the potentiality of human life, but did not think that the state could override a woman's right to privacy by adopting any, quote, one theory of life. But outside of the abortion context, various states and the federal government have adopted one theory of life and apparently resolved the difficult question. How can the legal status of the unborn child in the abortion context be squared with other areas of the law in which the unborn child is commonly recognized as a person entitled to equal protection of the laws and possessed of a right to life from the moment of conception? The court has not addressed this discrepancy. The law's inconsistent treatment of the unborn was recently highlighted once again by a decision from the Alabama Supreme Court in which the court ruled that a physician was liable for a wrongful death lawsuit for her negligent treatment of a pregnant woman who later miscarried. The court was aided in this determination by the fact that Alabama's homicide statute includes within the definition of person, quote, any unborn child in utero at any stage of development regardless of viability. These tensions existed even before Roe was decided, as some states' decision to legalize abortion between 1967 and 1973 clashed with the law's treatment of the unborn in other areas. So I talked about this a little bit in the last segment, all these different ways, particularly in tort law, in inheritance law. But there are other ways in which unborn children were being given and entitled to certain kinds of rights under the law. Here's another case. In a case decided by the New Jersey Supreme Court in 1964, the court ruled that the state was justified in forcing a pregnant Jehovah's Witness to receive blood transfusions that were necessary to save the life of her unborn child, despite her religious objections to transfusions. Okay, so Jehovah's Witnesses, for those of you who don't know, have a religious objection to receiving blood transfusions. It has been, in addition to being a belief of their particular religious confession, it has spurred a lot of very interesting constitutional law litigation. I've learned about a number of different Jehovah's Witnesses Supreme Court decisions. So basically, the court ruled that, so the state of New Jersey was basically, in 1964, they had this pregnant Jehovah's Witness. She didn't want to receive a blood transfusion. If she didn't, though, the life of her unborn child was at risk. And the New Jersey Supreme Court said, yeah, New Jersey, you're justified in forcing this woman to receive a blood transfusion in order to save the life of your unborn child, in spite of her religious objections to those transfusions. The court recognized the state's duty to give the unborn child equal protection of the law, despite the mom's assertion of a constitutional right not to receive the treatment. The unborn child's right to life is also evident from the fact that from the early common law to the present day, the law has provided for the suspension of execution for pregnant women sentenced to death. So that's another thing. That's another instance. Historically, you couldn't execute a pregnant gal, okay? The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which the United States is a party, this international treaty, holds that the death sentence, quote, shall not be carried out on a pregnant woman. Under federal law, a sentence of death shall not be carried out upon a woman while she is pregnant. These laws recognize that it would be unjust to execute an unborn child for the crimes of his or her mother in which he had no part. So this is a huge thing. This is just another area of the law in which we're treating the unborn child as a living human. Because basically, if you can execute the child's mother while she's pregnant, you're going to kill two people. And so American law says, absolutely not. We're not going to allow two people to be killed. Why? Because the unborn child is more than just a clump of cells. The unborn child is not just, a, quote, product of conception, as the left is now starting to refer to it. This is a human being. This is a living human person, which we afford certain kinds of legal protection. Perhaps the clearest example of abortion law's anomalous and unjustifiable treatment of the unborn child is the Federal Unborn Victims of Violence Act. This law, enacted in 2004, establishes that any individual who, quote, causes the death of or bodily injury to a child who is in utero at the time the conduct takes place is guilty of a separate offense from any offense committed at the same time against the pregnant woman and is liable to the same penalty that would accompany an identical offense against any person. So there are 38 states that echo this federal law. So it's not just California with the Connor and Lacey law. This is also a question of federal law that punishes people who harm a pregnant woman. That you can be prosecuted for this under federal law. Federal law is recognizing this, even though at the same time, Federal law is also recognizing this right to abortion. So this article from the Lozier Institute goes on, such laws point out a glaring inconsistency in American law that has only widened since Roe. The moral status of the unborn child cannot logically change depending on who is doing the killing. If it is a human person who is killed in fetal homicide cases, it must also be a human person who is killed in abortion. Making spurious distinctions between human beings and persons will not do. There are no human beings who are not persons, and all persons are entitled to equal protection under the law. Proponents of abortion must admit that what is taking place in abortion is the killing of a human person. Our laws already reflect this truth. Unable to deny that abortion ends a human life, supporters of abortion face the burden of arguing that abortion is the justified killing of a human person. Proving that it is just to end the life of an innocent child in the womb is a tall task indeed. Oh, this is actually written by Tim Bradley, who I believe is a former classmate of mine at Notre Dame. So good for Tim. All right. And this is just an excellent article. If you want to read it, I really recommend it. For those, because I hear it all the time from different friends of mine who ask me that, how come California can prosecute, people for 2 murders when, when they kill a pregnant lady? How does that work? How can that work and abortion still be legal? If you want to read this, follow Right to Life of Central California on Twitter, twitter.com/RightToLifeCA. It'll also be posted on our Facebook page, and you can also find it if you follow me on Twitter, at Fresno Johnny. That's at Fresno Johnny. And by the way, just want to conclude with this. If you support Right to Life of Central California, we really encourage you to help us out during coronavirus. Go to rtlcc.org. You can see our coronavirus update, all the stuff we're doing. We're still active. We're still working. We're still trying to educate the public about the topic of abortion. We're still outside of Planned Parenthood every day. If you want to help us, support us, join the 300 Club. Look, $25 a month. If you have $25 a month in streaming services that you never watch, maybe instead try to give some of that money to us. $300 a year, that's $25 a month. If every person in the sound of my voice were to do that, we at Right to Life of Central California, we would have nothing to fear from this coronavirus as far as being able to sustain our mission and our work. rtlcc.org is the place to go if you want to learn more about it. Thank you all for listening. This has been Right to Life Radio, Power Talk 96.7 AM 1400.